I'm writing a day after a seemingly chaotic shooting of two uh, two detainees in an ICE facility, where casings were found with one casing having anti-ICE written in Sharpie, um, and a dead gunman found outside the facility. It's a week after the fallout of the Charlie Kirk shooting, which again happened near me here in Utah at a school. And I have several people whose siblings are students, are children I know who were traumatized by the event. So, and I've said a lot about this, although not as much here. I don't usually cover real current events issues on radical engagements because this is about dealing with text and information. But I did want to dig into some key problems um, in a lot of the impulses we have to deal with the situation. And there's a short piece by Corey Robin that I really liked that really gets to the paradox here. Corey's work is quite good, and people have known him. I've followed his work now for over 15 years. His book on conservatism I reviewed a long time ago, mostly positively, with a few caveats here and there for fine distinctions that he did not uh, fully get into. But I wanted to talk about his short piece here on Lincoln and our impulses right now. And I wanted to suggest a book, actually, Lincoln's Tragic Pragmatism, Lincoln, Douglas, and Moral Conflict by John Burt, came out from Harvard. I believe 12 years ago. Now, I think the analysis of the John Burt's book is under a materialist, but I do think there's some key points about the pragmatism of Lincoln that people miss and how it frankly didn't work. It neither stopped the Civil War from happening nor stopped the revanchist period after it, um, when the radical Republicans' agenda and Reconstruction was stopped in its track by compromises made by Hayes. So let's get into this little short piece by Corey Robbins to get us thinking about this. One thing I complain about socialists in America and in North America in general, and is we often don't know U.S. and Canadian history beyond like the 1960s. A lot of people can rattle off things from Russian history, but don't know anything about their own. And Russian history is important, don't get me wrong, and particularly the history of the USSR, but this stuff is important too. Corey Robbins. Lincoln's lesson lost. When calls for reconciliation don't stick. I understand the impulse at moments like these for politicians and public spokespersons to say that we need to talk across the divide, to acknowledge our similarities amid our difference, that we need leaders who understand that there is no red America, no blue America, just America. I mean, I understand the impulse too, but I always think it's false. In fact, I would say America is more fragmented than even the red and blue makes it seem. Both the political ideologies and the regional interest are fragmented. What are you going to do about it? It's not my way of writing or speaking. It's not mine either. But it runs deep in our political tradition, so it's not surprising that people would turn to it. Looking for precedents, people often evoke Lincoln, particularly his first and second inaugurals, are the conciliatory parts of the second. the leader who bound up our wounds, who bore malice towards none and charity for all. And that didn't work out so well, frankly. But Lincoln is an instructive case for a different reason, and that is despite starting his career issuing bromides for peace and reconciliation, he came to understand as time went on a rather different alliance between words and deeds, toleration and power, reconciliation and reality. And even then, he didn't go far enough. After all, a lot of people talk about punishing the Confederacy. I think the non-planter class of the Confederacy was thoroughly punished, but its leadership was not. The fact that Nathan Bedford Forrest was a free man should not have happened. From a young age, specifically when he was 28 years old, long before he came to national prominence, Lincoln had an uncanny sense that the growing violence of Jacksonian America was caught up with the question of slavery and abolition. In 1838, he delivered a fascinating address to the Young Men's Lyceum in Springfield, where he meditated on the grounding predilection for violence, both political and apolitical, and offered cautionary words about where things were headed. Despite his keen understanding of the roots of the violence in this direction, the best counsel Lincoln could offer at this point was that all Americans needed to recommit themselves to the rule of law and the Constitution. You know, we've been saying this thing since before our modern understanding of the rule of law and Constitution existed. Back when people did not refer to themselves as Americans, but as members of their state. However, he warned some Napoleon type would come along and do one of two terrible things: free the enslaved or enslave the free. You know, oh, the dangers of demagoguery, those Caesarists and Bonapartists that even the Caesarists and Bonapartists themselves recognized. Despite his opposition to slavery, in other words, Lincoln's recommendation at this point was for people to gird their loins of lawfulness against the truly violent, the abolitionists and the enslavers. Both sides do it. We in the middle must not. Oh, these long bromides go back a long way. What made Lincoln great was not that early speech, though it's interesting and prophetic in all sorts of ways that I can't do justice to here. See the Hayes Compromise. You need to understand the Hayes Compromise. Yes, Reconstruction failed, but the Hayes Compromise is more why than anything else. And the failure to punish Confederate leadership, right? I think crushing the sharecroppers and turning the South into textile mills that is often left out of the Confederacy didn't get enough narrative was pretty bad. The Confederacy became an internal periphery, both for the black workers who were reduced to all but still remaining slaves, and the white workers who were little better. And this remained true till the middle of the 20th century. The South didn't go through the same waves of industrialization that the Northeast and Midwest did. It was never economically profitable until the late 20th century. And even then, it's been consistently poorer than the rest of the country the entire time. But the fact that Confederate leadership was not punished never, ever needs to be forgotten, because they made the core of what would become the Dixiecrats later on. Both freebooters who wanted to expand slavery and the Confederate anti-imperialists who became anti-imperialist on racist grounds to opposed responses geopolitically to what happened after the Civil War. Both sides were rooted in a right reaction and enabled the leadership to play off the poverty of poor whites in the South against an even more impoverished black community. This is important to understand. And Lincoln does bear some fault for it. All right. Nor was it as later giving into some bloodthirsty militarism during the Civil War, where he didn't even originally promise free slaves, by the way. Though there's moments of holy violence in his second inaugural that send shivers up my spine, and I cannot read it aloud without my throat seizing up and my voice cracking. No, what made Lincoln great was that he understood that in the end, there would be no establishment of the rule of law until justice had been served and slavery abolished. Although he hid that for a long time, Corey. I think you know that. There could be no refusal of violence that would stick, that would be anything more than the blandest sacrimony, the emptiest piety, until the underlying social violence, the combination of the, quote, Negro question, unquote, and labor question was resolved through concerned action by the state. And the labor question was crucial for the radical Republicans too, which is part of why there were so many European socialist immigrants from 1848 supporting it, and why Marx was writing for a Republican newspaper in New York. Anyway, stuff that most people in America don't know. What makes today's call for regulation and pleas for recognition of everyone's humanity so formulaic, even feckless, is they are severed from any sort of action or social awareness, their thoughts and prayers. At best, they rest on a studied inattention to the underlying social and economic roots of the problem. I mean, isn't that what politics in America has been, is a studied inattention to the social and economic roots of the problem? At this point, politicians who speak this way sound like the very abolitionists who were rightly derided as crackpot utopians for their need belief in moral suasion without state action or non-state action. You know, just that everything would eventually get better, could somehow win the day against slavery. The difference is that those abolitionists have no power. Many of these politicians do. Social peace in bourgeois terms cannot be brought about by good wishes, thoughts, and prayers, and reaching across the aisle alone. If the aisle has material consequences and comes from material realities, you need to ask yourself why appealing to our battle angels rarely ever works. This returns me to John Burt's Lincoln's tragic pragmatism and how it manifested in the Lincoln-Douglas campaign. Burt basically asserts that Lincoln and Douglas struggle with how to behave when an ethical conflict as profound as the one of slavery strained commitment upon democracy, namely the rule of consent and principles, and because neither side could consent to it. This commitment is not easily met, but because what conscience demands and what one is able to persuade others to consent to are not always the same. What Lincoln ultimately avoided was a politics of morality attached from consent. He tried to pull everyone together. And Douglas avoided a politics of experience devoid of morality. Neither found a way for liberalism to mediate the conflict of slavery. AKA, this is a moral and political economic conflict, and if you don't deal with it, you will have to deal with it by force. And neither side could. Burt's point is there are some things that lie beyond the horizon of deal making and reaching across the aisle, either by expediency or by moral suasion. This is tragic, and it leads to things like civil wars, and civil wars are so costly that I don't think most people get how bad they are. The American Civil War, the bloodiest civil war in U.S. history, only killed 2 to 3% of the population. I mean, I said bloody Civil War. I mean, the Revolutionary War is also so bloody, but it was the bloodiest war per capita we've ever been in. Mexican-American War wasn't so bloody per capita. The Spanish-American War wasn't so bloody per capita. Neither of the world wars were so bloody per capita. The Vietnam War was not so bloody per capita. And yet, as civil wars go, or even as uprisings and insurrections that have a violent nature go, the American Civil War is not that bad. Its field of action was relatively limited to a strip around geographically discrete areas. Most civil wars, rebellions, and uprisings, particularly in highly urban areas, don't go that way. As I've mentioned, the Taiping Rebellion in 19th century China killed about 10% of its population. Lower estimates have about 7%. But in a population orders of magnitude larger than the United States at the time, you can see what the cost is. The Russian Civil War killed between 3 and 5% of its population. The religious wars in Europe of the 13th century killed massive amounts of the population per capita. What are you going to do about it? Because appeals to reaching across the aisle don't change the march of history if it's heading that way. Reformists hoping on moral suasion and goodwill, unfortunately, usually lose. Robin is not wrong about that. I'd like to thank the good professor for his article. I'll post it in the show notes. Check out a Substack. You can find more if you like and subscribe, and protect your peace. It's going to get harder to do.